Welcome to Sino-Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer.
Today we're going to tackle the complex, often intriguing subject of deception. Even though it's now all-pervasive, the focus will be on historical theory and practice in the military realm, with an occasional reference to deception's use in political contexts. And although I've written extensively about its exploitation in the West and discussed the observations of astute military thinkers such as Maurice and Leo VI in my Lever of Power, Military Deception in China and the West, I'll be confining our discussion to China itself. Now, surprisingly, in spite of the Trojan Horse's nearly universal fame, the notion that the Greeks, and especially the Romans, shunned the use of deceit, ruses, and stratagems in both politics and warfare holds sway. Furthermore, it's often claimed that European warfare has always been, and therefore should be, direct, confrontational, and courageous. In contrast, Chinese warfare is somewhat stupidly said to have been inherently deceptive, evasive, and manipulative, that it tended to avoid direct confrontation, and consisted mainly of skirmishes and meeting engagements instead of decisive battles, even though in China conflict was unremitting and forces of hundreds of thousands often clashed, as we discussed in the introduction to our series of talks. Despite sometimes dramatic success, such as in the closing days of World War II, deception therefore tends to be disparaged in the West as a tool of the weak and the pernicious, the chosen mode of barbarians and other duplicitous peoples. However, even a cursory reading of Greek and Roman historical writings shows that from their inception through the 10th century Byzantium, the Western states continuously employed deceit, maneuver, betrayal, false treaties, and other innovative and unexpected measures that are normally encompassed under the rubric of stratagems and the unorthodox. Incidents in which these practices played a crucial role are preserved not just in the early histories, but also in the military manuals, including Frontenac's 1st century AD Stratagemeton and Polyana's 2nd century AD Strategica. Taken together, these two books from the Western tradition identify nearly 1,500 examples in which skillful commanders in earlier eras adroitly employed deceptive techniques to wrest victory. Now, apart from having similarly inflicted incalculable casualties over the centuries, China and the West both have virtually unbroken traditions of innovating deceit and employing deception. The chief difference lies in China's abiding recognition of deception's surpassing importance and the development of ever more sophisticated analysis within a continuous written military corpus, despite often acerbic condemnation from self-serving members of the entrenched bureaucracy and purportedly righteous thinkers. Now, it may seem otherwise, but deceit has difficulty succeeding in a world populated solely by charlatans, doubters, and unbelievers. Many factors incline people to trust others, but a pervasive cultural orientation to fidelity, trust, and trustworthiness, one that results in cheaters being scorned and liars ostracized, ironically facilitates the perpetration of deceptive measures. Early China emphasized righteousness, credibility, benevolence, and observing the dictates of the rites and of ritual, all of which contributed to social order and a quiescent populace. Credibility was stressed in both political relations and military actions, and it was even thought that nothing was possible without it. In fact, Confucius said, quote, "I don't know how a man without credibility can survive." Nevertheless, there were always dissenting voices. A more realistic approach to warfare eventually emerged that would negatively impact the strength of belief, though never eliminate its advocacy entirely. A critical turning point can be seen in the political turmoil that marked the increasingly aggressive relationships of the spring and autumn states as they battled to dominate the realm. In 638 BC, Duke Xiang of Song, he was trying to fill the newly vacant role of hegemon, even though it required thwarting volatile Chu's ambitions in the south. When Song besieged Zheng, one of Chu's client states, Zheng naturally sought Chu's aid. Being significantly outnumbered, Song's forces had little hope of surviving unless they resorted to innovative tactics, or they managed to take advantage of a momentary advantage. But when an opportunity arose, Duke Xiang refused to abandon what he claimed was a lifelong practice of virtue to wrest a quick victory by having his well-deployed troops attack Chu's forces as they forded the river. And he similarly refused to strike the enemy before they assembled on the riverbank. When he finally ordered the assault, Chu's formidable forces quickly repulsed Song's army and severely defeated them. The Duke, who eventually succumbed, was wounded in the thigh, and most of his officers died. Castigated for his stupidity, what would you expect? He countered, "A true ruler doesn't wound someone twice or capture those showing gray hair." The minister of war retorted, "My lord still doesn't understand warfare. Heaven is sustaining us when our fierce enemies are in a defile, or they haven't deployed into formation. If they are in a ravine, shouldn't we still beat the drums for an attack? Even then we would fear not being victorious. Moreover, all these stalwarts are our enemies. Even if they are old and mature, if we can capture them alive, we should seize them. What does gray hair matter?" He then added, "You should make clear the nature of shame and teach warfare." And that's a comment that subsequently became a famous military saying throughout Chinese history. Spring and autumn covenants, the agreements describing commitments between states, were always witnessed by men and sanctified by the spirits. Sincerity in their undertaking, unwavering fidelity to the terms were considered sacrosanct. But such vaunted credibility created the possibility that rulers and commanders, especially those who found themselves in disadvantageous circumstances, could readily deceive their enemies and survive another day, maybe even vanquish them. The era's historians sought to avoid chronicling such behavior, to preclude others learning from it, but a few 6th century examples have managed to survive. For example, in 576 BC, the famous Chu statesman Xiphan advised mounting a northern expedition against the hapless state of Zheng. Zheng was always getting pummeled because they're right in the middle of the empire. Now, at this time, Zheng was nominally submissive to Qin, even though Chu had recently concluded a non-aggression pact with Qin. So when an official criticized him for planning to violate the agreement, Xiphan replied, "If we can gain an advantage over the enemy, we should advance. The covenant is irrelevant." 30 years later, when queried about his planned violation of the Li, the prescribed forms of behavior, Sumu, another Chu high official, retorted, "Credibility has long been absent in our relations. It's only a question of whether the affair is advantageous or not. If we realize our ambitions, what use is credibility?" So treaties and covenants, they weren't just losing their effectiveness. Perverse intentions were often present from the outset. Deceit had emerged. Now, as discussed in our Swinza talks, the art of war's emphasis upon manipulating the enemy in order to balk plans and create the circumstances for victory made deception an integral component. Even though feigned retreats and phony weaknesses had already appeared, the art of war's assertion that warfare is the Tao of deception provided a major impetus to conceiving and consciously exploiting it to mislead and obfuscate the enemy. Deceit and its corollary, unorthodox warfare, another subject of a Swinza talk, facilitated many significant victories in the Warring States period and thereafter. While the classic military writers acknowledged the importance of deception, the next great impetus had to await the Tang Dynasty, when the surpassing commander Li Jing discussed it in the eclectic theoretician Li Chuan. Another of the art of war's important commentators offered some critical thoughts about its role in his Taibai Yin Jing. However, it was Du You's innovative Tongdian, an encyclopedic compilation that initiated the case study approach in China, as we've discussed previously, that really made the nature of deception clear by explicating brief theoretical discussions with illustrative examples drawn from China's storied military history. Thereafter, despite the frequent inability of commanders to grasp the essence, or to employ incisive ploys because of the massiveness of their troops. Both thought and practice became more expansive and complex until the pinnacle of sophistication, hiding shadows in shadows, in a late Ming Dynasty work titled The Bingfa Baiyan, or 100 Tactical Terms. Now, this is an intriguing story, one that I devoted several chapters to in Lever and Power, but rather academic and turgid. So rather than getting bogged down in theoretical issues of development, I'll mention important developments as they may be relevant to our categorical consideration of the frequently practiced forms of deception, and concludes today's talk by briefly looking at the terminology. In many records and discussions of historical events, the terms commonly employed for naming an action deceitful or deceptive never appear. However, a handful are repeatedly employed in the remainder, as well as in the historical writings and the classical military works. The most common is gui, as in Swin's assertion about warfare being the Tao of deception, gui, and jia. Both gui and jia mean deceit or deception as nouns, and deceive as a verb. However, gui sometimes appears in the sense of contravening or going contrary to prohibitions or what was appropriate to the time and the seasons. And despite some commentators discerning slight distinctions, by the time written works of any length had evolved, gui and jia were essentially interchangeable. Now, another fairly common character, qi, as in qidi, trick the enemy, deceive the enemy, the title adopted by the Chinese publishers for the translation of my book on unorthodox warfare, The Tao of Deception. It entails the idea of tricking or cheating someone. There's also jue, which means tricky, as well as wily. Several other terms associated with deceptive measures, or which otherwise connote deceit, occasionally appear. While not exhaustive, they include huang, which means to lie, and it consists of the signifier for word, and right here on the left, and a component on the right, which by itself means madness or crazy. Then we have the word to deceive, the very important term huo, to delude or befuddle. People always want to huo the enemy. And to wu, again, another important word, which means to mislead or cause people to misunderstand or make a mistake. And here we have yo. Now, that means to incite, or maybe lure on, something like that. In later periods, we have pian, to cheat. And finally, the commonly used yang, which very frequent today. And finally, there's, my gosh, there's a whole lot, aren't there? Finally, there's jian, which is another term for perfidy or duplicity, and wei, which is best understood as a false, artificial, or pseudo. It's worth noting that in this series of terms, gui, jia, jue, huang, and wu, on the left, you always have the signifier for word, which suggests that deception is a verbal affair, one that may have originated in lying. And lying looks like this. This is huangyan, to lie, rather than actions. But of course, it's actions which make deception possible in the military circumstance most of the time. Finally, I'd like to conclude by noting a couple of echoes. In explicating the key pronouncement, warfare is the Tao of deception, gui, no less a figure than the great, though much vilified General Cao Cao, who's also the earliest known commentator to the art of war. He said, the army does not have a constant shape. It takes deceit and deception as its Tao. And the terms here, gui jia, for deceit and deception. Li Chuan preferred a classic observation frequently uttered by commanders in the Three Kingdoms period, including Cao Cao. The army never tires of deception, jia. In a greater context, Zhang Yu asserted, even though the army's employment is founded upon benevolence and righteousness. Seizing victory lies in wei jia. And in commenting upon the art of war's other assertion, the army is established through deceit, again, jia, Mei Yao Chun said, apart from the Tao of deception, wei, it's not possible to succeed.
As always, thank you for watching.